And it's about how the world monetary systems have evolved. And I'll show you that every 30 to 40 years, the world has a brand new monetary system, and people really didn't know that we go through we go along and pressures build up in a monetary system. It starts to develop stress cracks and implode, and there's an emergency meeting of a bunch of finance ministers, and they try and come up with a new world monetary system. This chart here is from J.P. Morgan. Anybody that reads Zero Hedge may have seen it. It's been in quite a number of newsletters. And what it shows is that reserve currency status, right now the US dollar is the world's reserve currency. All countries hold some US dollars to settle international trade. That it's a temporary thing. All reserve currency status eventually ends. And what you see is before the US, it was Great Britain. The British pound was the reserve currency, and the Bank of England did all of the international settlements. Before that, it wasn't really reserve currencies, so this chart is a bit mislabeled. It was actually just predominant currencies. You didn't have really organized central banks that held other currencies in reserve and one currency to settle international trade. What you had was a currency that happened to be the majority of the currency on the planet. And then the Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal. And so when I was writing my book back in 2005 and 6, I sort of stumbled across all of this accidentally. I'm a believer in cycles. And I took every currency crisis, every stock market crash, every bad depression that we had had, every bank run that we had had, put them all into a spreadsheet just to see if I could find some regularity in a cycle when it comes to the dates of these things. And what I found stuck out at me, it just leapt out at me, and I started doing research on it, and I was Googling, and I mean, over a period of weeks, I must have spent an entire day trying to figure out changes in world monetary systems, and nobody had written about it to that date. I couldn't find any information on it other than reading about the monetary system, but nobody had put together yet that every 30 to 40 years there was this shift in world monetary system. So these are the world monetary systems. Before World War I, we had the classical gold standard, where a country would issue a gold note that was fully redeemable in an amount of gold, and if there was $20 in circulation in the US that said it was redeemable in gold, there was a $20 gold piece at the Treasury. So it was a 100% reserve ratio, fully backed. And then along comes World War I, and countries lit up the printing presses, went off of the classical gold standard, and between the wars, they patched together something called the gold exchange standard. And when the Federal Reserve was established, they made it legal to commit fraud and lie. And they could put $50 of gold notes in circulation, promising to pay gold for every $20 gold piece in the vault. It was a 40% reserve ratio. And the international settlement was done with a combination. Before World War I, it was British pounds. After World War I, the world's central banks could hold British pounds, US dollars, British bonds, or US bonds as reserves. So it was a mixture. And it was a very poorly designed system, and it started to implode during the latter half of the Great Depression and then fully imploded during World War II. So in 1944, a bunch of the finance ministers from around the world got together, and economists at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and came up with something called the Bretton Woods system. During both wars, the U.S. had loaned currency to all of the combatant nations to help them rebuild, and loaned currency to the Allies during the war to help fund the war. And so the world was sort of flooded with US dollars. So it was decided that at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, that all the world's currencies would be backed by US dollars, and the US dollar would be convertible into gold to foreign central banks only at $35 per ounce. So this is a completely different system than the previous one, which was completely different than the one before that. And so any foreign central bank could go to the New York Fed and turn in $35 and get an ounce of gold back. And then the problem with that is that those countries actually did that. They came and cashed in their dollars, And when they cashed in their dollars, it meant gold was leaving the vaults of the U.S. And from 59 to 71, the U.S. lost 50% of its gold. And the redemptions were increasing, not decreasing. And we were going to run out of gold, but we had printed tons of dollars. We only had about $1 worth of gold for every $8 worth of claim checks on gold, the base money that foreign central banks were holding that was outstanding. And so Nixon was forced to end the Bretton Woods system where the dollar was pegged to gold on August 15th of 71. But when he did that, he unwittingly unpegged all currencies. All currencies were pegged to gold and backed by gold, but through the US dollar. So when he severed that tie, it wasn't just the dollar becoming a fiat currency on August 15th of 71, it was the entire planet's currency supply. Every country on the planet was suddenly unpegged from gold. And the reason that we went on the US dollar standard globally is a complete accident. It wasn't, they did have something called the Washington Accord. There were meetings to try and create a new monetary system, but the new monetary system had already happened. It was a default. All the world had been flooded with dollars because of the wars and then the Bretton Woods system. And when they stopped the redemption rights, we just went on floating exchange rates, and we ended up with the US dollar standard. And it is the most poorly designed of all these currency systems. However, there is the reason that it's lasted for 43 years is because there's nothing waiting in the wings to take its place. The world being flooded with dollars meant that the dollar standard was sort of waiting in the wings when Bretton Woods imploded. But the result is that classical gold standard 30 to 40 years, the gold exchange standard 30 years, Bretton Woods 28 years, the US dollar standard 43 years plus, and there's something coming.
全世界原来认美元是因为它背后有黄金，现在你背后有什么东西我认你。美国政府知道，这个时候的美元，它必须成为一种信用货币。一个货币总是要跟某种商品挂钩，全世界才能认它。于是美国人认定，美元必须跟大宗商品挂钩。哪个大宗商品是人人都需要，哪个发展中国家都需要它。然后呢，你就跟它挂钩，最后选择的是石油。
1973年，为了减少美元信用下降的风险，时任美国财长的西蒙与欧佩克官员达成了一项重要协议，将美元作为全球石油资源唯一的计价和结算工具。这一协议让刚与黄金脱钩不久的美元，转眼又与全世界最重要的能源紧密联系在一起，为美元的霸权地位加上了一道保险。自此之后，随着世界经济发展所需的石油量加大，对美元的需求也相应加大。在世界货币博弈中，美元再次拥有了无可比拟的优势。
全球的石油交易用美元结算意味着什么？意味着从此美元跟全球最大宗的商品挂钩之后，然后这个美元的需求出来了。你们不是不在乎美元吗？你在不在乎石油呢？你只要需要买石油，对不起，拿美元来，用美元结算。
此后，谁敢挑战美元霸权，谁就是美国的敌人。1999年，欧元诞生。欧元作为世界上第二种国际结算货币，偷偷挑战着美元的霸主地位。紧接着3月，科索沃战争爆发，美国对着欧洲的心脏南联盟科索沃地区狂轰滥炸78天，之后欧元暴跌30%，带动欧洲经济的7000亿热钱纷纷出逃，欧洲经济从此一蹶不振，而这笔钱大部分去了美国，直接带动那里连续90个月的经济繁荣。
欧元的出现，毫无疑问对美元的霸权地位是一个挑战，因为在此之前，已经有半个多世纪，美元是一币独大的，没有一个货币可以跟美元比肩，没有一种货币能够担负起国际结算货币的这样的重担、这样的责任，可是欧元出现了， 欧元起码在欧元区，欧元区是多大一个经济区呢？26、7万亿的一个庞大的经济体，比北美经济体24、5万亿的经济体还要庞大。这样庞大的一个经济体，你突然不使用美元结算，完全在你内部都用欧元结算，而且欧元还有溢出效应。你比如说被伊拉克等等这些国家接受，世界上30%多的经济是用欧元结算的。不管怎么说，对于100%用美元结算来讲，它已经削去了，它已经切走了一块利益。
2003年3月，美国以伊拉克隐藏有大规模杀伤性武器，并暗中支持恐怖分子为借口，绕开联合国安理会，公然单方面决定对伊拉克实施大规模军事打击，导致国际原油市场油价疯狂的飙升，同时也打出了世界各国对于美元的需求。
原来你准备38美元就可以买1桶石油了，现在美国一打伊拉克战争，从38美元油价上升到149美元，最高的时候还摸高到150美元。你需要比原来多出4倍还多的美元才购买1桶石油，你准备的是不够的，你的美元准备不够，你就去拿美元，从美国政府手里拿。
而另一个更被人们忽略的事实就是，在海湾战争后，被美国和西方用禁飞区和经济制裁逼得走投无路的萨达姆，在获得联合国石油换食品计划的许可后，迫不及待地宣布改用欧元作为伊拉克石油的结算货币。这一激怒美国之举，最终导致了伊拉克战争的爆发，并把萨达姆送上了绞刑架。而当小布什总统宣布伊拉克战争大获全胜之际，美国人也顺便把石油结算由欧元改回了美元。就在今年8月底，默克尔来中国访问，公告中德贸易结算用彼此货币。紧接着9月，希拉里展开环太平洋访问，最后一站来到中国，告诫中国不可与欧洲结盟，尤其结算货币不能用彼此货币。
美国最大的利益是什么呢？一个是通过输出美元从全世界很廉价的获得产品以后加价出售， GDP 就上去了，这是一个。另外一个呢，美国人通过向全世界发行国债，让美元重新回流美国，美国再通过这个金融衍生产品这一块又极大的获取了全球的利益。
今天的美国是一个建立在美元上的帝国，在美国国内70%左右的就业人口从事的都是金融业或金融服务业。美国的国家安全已经与金融安全融为一体，要让这个帝国不垮塌，就必须保持美元的霸权，而这个霸权又是由全世界来买单的，
因为他用绿纸换回了全世界人辛辛苦苦的劳动所得。
I believe that because there's no other system waiting in the wings to just sort of take over, that this is going to be very chaotic and very painful for most people. In 1971, August 15th, Nixon removed the gold backing and all the world's currencies became fiat floating currencies. And then there was this nice calm before the storm and everything worked just fine. And that's the way it was in all the previous monetary systems. They worked fine for a while, and then pressures build up, disequilibria happens, and stress cracks start to develop, and then it starts to implode. And so that happened until Saddam Hussein started selling oil in euros. Well, we know how that worked out for him. Then along comes the 2008 crisis. Then Iran ends oil sales in dollars. We have quantitative easing too, and add another $600 billion to the currency supply in the base money in the United States. Then Muammar Gaddafi announces that he planned to sell oil in other currencies like the euro and gold, and we know how that worked out for him. China and Russia bypassed the dollar. Chinese president says dollar reserves are a product of the past. Utah recognizes silver and gold as money. China and Iran bypass the dollar. Venezuela repatriates their gold. China and Japan allow currency swaps. India and Japan bypass the dollar. Russia and Iran trade directly. Iran sells India oil for rupees and commodities. China and Brazil trade directly. African countries ban the dollar. Now, for a while in Zambia, you could go to jail for using U.S. dollars. There were a number of countries that were trying to get off of the... there's countries around the world that are very dollarized. For instance, in South America, there are countries where most of the currency supply is U.S. dollars. They don't use much of their own national currency. I've spoken in Peru, and there it's about a 50-50 mix, and every cab driver, every grocery store, they all take either currency, it doesn't matter, and they know what the exchange rate is, and they're used to it. And so QE3, print to infinity, well, they've announced tapering. Maybe infinity doesn't go forever. However, they're tapering into weakness. The U.S. economy isn't that strong right now. This is a bad time to taper. It would have been better to taper last year. So they're tapering into weakness, so we'll see how this works out for them, but I don't think it's going to work out that well. Iran trades energy for gold. Germany increases the rate of its repatriation of gold from the Federal Reserve from 150 to 300 metric tons. And all of these nails are falling on the dates in this timeline, and you can see how there's more and more and more of them closer and closer together. They're speeding up. Japan increases their... Have you heard of Abenomics? How many people have heard of Abenomics? Okay. Well, in Japan, they're trying to beat deflation by just expanding the currency supply, and it doesn't work. If you're a Keynesian, you think it'll work, but Japan's been trying it now for 2 decades, and it hasn't worked yet, and so now the U.S. is trying it. And every country on the planet is printing to beat hell. China considers gold, not the dollar, as a yuan reference. So right now, internationally, you know, when you're trading yuan, it's always priced in dollars. They're considering trying to peg it to gold somehow. China agrees to a $45 billion swap line with the ECB, the European Central Bank. Well, that means that when Europe buys Japanese cars, they now pay in euros. They don't pay in dollars. So the dollar is no longer required. More than half of all the world's currency is U.S. dollars. More than half of those dollars reside outside the United States. They're sloshing around the planet in this international trade, and now countries are skipping the U.S. dollar, so it isn't as necessary. So all those dollars will eventually come back home to the U.S., and that's when the U.S. will see a big inflation. We saw a huge inflation of real estate back in the late 80s as Japan, with their big stock market bubble, came to the United States and bought up all of the prime real estate like Rockefeller Center and most of downtown Los Angeles. An enormous inflation in real estate. We're going to be seeing the same thing as all of these dollars that are used in international trade come home because they no longer need them around the rest of the world. Korea signs a deal with Indonesia for a currency swap agreement worth $10 billion. Australia does a currency swap deal with Korea and opens up a trading exchange for Chinese yuan. New Zealand does a currency deal with China. Just a month ago, there were 23 countries that set up swap lines to bypass the U.S. dollar. I believe it was last week or the week before, Russia, China, and Iran decided to drop the dollar in bilateral trade. So these countries no longer have to settle in U.S. dollars when they're settling between them. And while they were discussing that deal, they set up a meeting where China and Russia signed 30 agreements, and one of them is a $400 billion gas deal, and in all of these agreements, the U.S. dollar is no longer required.
虽然通常认为一种货币的国际化需经历3个阶段：贸易结算、金融交易计价，成为储备货币，而货币互换不过是人民币走出的第一步。但是人们还是看到了人民币国际化的破冰之旅在以一种过去想象不到的速度悄然推进。今年3月29日，中国人民银行与阿根廷中央银行宣布签订700亿元人民币等值双边货币互换框架协议。协议约定，阿根廷从中国进口商品时可以使用人民币，不必再用美元做交易中介货币。
这个意义呢，就是 说白俄罗斯在和中国签订这个货币互换协议不到1周以后就宣布，他从中国借的200亿人民币已经是他的外汇储备的一部分。那也就是说，人民币现在已经成为一些国家的这个外汇储备。
2009年3月25日，国务院审议并原则通过关于推进上海加快发展现代服务业和先进制造业，建设国际金融中心和国际航运中心的意见，提出到2020年将上海基本建成与中国经济实力和人民币国际地位相适应的国际金融中心。
这个下一步就是人民币国际化的，现在要做的是一个内功，需要把人民币定值的债券市场整个金融市场发展起来，而在未来的1-2年时间，人民币国际化还有更多的想象不到的要发生。
The move towards global unity is vastly believed by the world to bring about a new age of peace and security, the cornerstones for protecting our modern way of life. But what is the real purpose to it all? Is it really to bring about global equality, or establish peace? Or does it really come down to what's most important to the people of this world? Money. When it comes down to it, everything is controlled and revolves around the world's financial systems. Food, medical care, transportation, shelter, technological advancement and entertainment. A collapse in these systems would result in the loss of the quality of life so many have become accustomed to. But the foundation and the financial structures of the world have been cracking for quite some time, and nations are beginning to take notice. The final piece, laying the groundwork for the prophetic globalization puzzle, is financial unification. Just as the world has been unionizing politically and religiously, it is inevitable that the world will eventually be unified through a single world currency.
Where it would be much easier to come in, and if there's a collapse happening in a confederacy of nations, then someone can come in and say, hey, we can help you out.
Given the circumstances of the world today, this may be the only solution to prevent events such as the U.S. housing crash of October 2008 that quickly affected nearly every industry on Earth, triggering a global recession and damaging some of the world's most dominant currencies. We have begun to realize just how intertwined and fragile our global financial systems truly are. As long as we live under the current economic structure, the world lives under the threat of future global economic depression or even collapse.
The move towards global financial control is already happening in various areas. In the European Union, as they've established a one currency between the nations, I've seen this in my lifetime. I was over in Germany in the military, for 18 months, and there was the mark. In France, there was the franc. Various countries, they had their individual currencies. Now that has happened there. If you would have told me that 40 years ago, I'd have said, you're crazy. It's never going to take place. But we have seen regional globalization of finances. What currency we will end up with, I truly do not know. But it may be the euro. It may be something from some other worldwide source. It might be a new currency that no one's ever heard about that will indeed be the worldwide currency.
Don't think it could ever happen. It's already begun. At a recent G8 summit in Italy, the leaders of the world discussed their growing concern over global financial security and openly discussed drastic new ideas to create financial stability. It was during this summit that the idea of a global currency was officially born. This is the first minted prototype that was presented to and discussed by the leaders of the world at the G8 summit, including Barack Obama of the United States and the President of the European Union. For the first time in history, the world's most influential nations have come together to recognize, discuss, and embrace the possibility of establishing a single worldwide currency to secure and control global financial markets. In fact, this coin was also presented to the Pope of the Catholic Church by representatives of the Royal Canadian Mint, seemingly foreshadowing the future foretold by prophecy and the unification between politics, religion, and finance. The world is rapidly becoming more accepting of this new global ideology like never before. In theory, global financial control should result in global financial security.
So the illusion is that global financial control will give global financial stability. But I don't believe that that is the case, because once that takes place, you have a central control, and you will be able to, that central control will be able to manipulate the finances of the entire world. And I don't believe that there's anybody on the face of the earth who can do that with a pure heart, with good intentions, and without greed factoring in, because those things have been part of mankind for a very, very long time.
This is not to say that the currency presented at the G8 summit will by any means become the new worldwide currency. However, the event presents an unprecedented shift in global thinking among world leaders and financial institutions.